From the heart of Central Florida, you're listening to the most electrifying show in media. A Neighbor's Choice. I'm your host, your neighbor, David Gornoski. So glad to be back with you live for another journey through the news and headlines of our time. We're going to roll up our sleeves and look at the problems neighbor to neighbor with common sense as our guide, not the toxic, dumb groupthink coming out of D.C. and the New York City media. We are here in Florida, the capital of the Liberty Movement, and we are going to build on the momentum we have established thus far in this area, and we're doing so by giving you the facts and not getting into hysteria, not getting into groupthink, and that's the most important thing, because if you have information, if you have an accurate and open free press, something we really don't have today, we have cutouts for these oligarchic industries and government agencies. That's what the media actually represents. They are PR firms for special interests, and they just brand themselves as a news desk so that it gives you more authority for you to accept what they're telling you as gospel. Joining me is someone who cuts through the noise and confusion on the matter which I believe is the most pressing, perhaps, to deal with, is the Ukraine conflict, the proxy war that we've been waging over there. We have with us Colonel Douglas Macgregor. How you doing, sir?
Great, David.
It's great to have you on, and of course we're headed into Thanksgiving this week, but a lot to be thankful for. And one of the things that I hope we can be thankful for is that perhaps there is some signal that even the war machine establishment is growing tired of the shenanigans going on in the proxy war in Ukraine. We have the incident in which Zelenskyy jumped at the moment to try to pinpoint blame of those two missiles that killed two people in Poland. And then everybody said, wait a second, you just tried to draw us into something that could have been absolutely devastating. That might have been his jump the shark moment. What do you think?
You know, David, Zelenskyy has made a terrible mistake by trying to pin the missile strikes on Russia. Everyone knows that the Russians had nothing to do with it, and what he's done is sacrifice what little credibility he has left. Increasingly, he's viewed, especially in Europe, where more and more truth is getting through to the populations. He's seen as the mayor of the capital of disinformation and fiction. The truth is that the situation Ukraine finds itself in right now is really quite desperate. The Russians have systematically dismantled most of the energy system. People are lacking in terms of heat, and the lack of heat is not the only problem when you destroy the energy grid. It also has implications for the availability of water and transportation and food and so forth. Bottom line is Ukraine is being prepared for a massive offensive launched by the Russians sometime over the next week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, once the ground is thoroughly frozen. And that buildup right now has reached about 540,000 Russian troops, over 300,000 in the south, a little over 200,000 in the north, with 1,000 rocket artillery systems, 5,000 armored fighting vehicles, including at least 1,500 tanks, huge quantities of artillery, tactical ballistic missiles. All of these things have been readied for a massive assault that is designed ultimately to end the war. And tragically, we keep insisting that the Ukrainians not negotiate, that they talk about it but do nothing. And this really consigns Ukraine and its population to more suffering and certain defeat.
So, there was some reports that General Mark Milley and others were starting to say, hey, we need to have some kind of peace or resolution to this conflict. Do you think there's anything to that, or is the D.C. establishment going to continually to double down in the midst of this, what could be very bloody winter?
I think General Milley is aware of what I just described. He knows about the Russian military buildup. He knows the true state of the Ukrainian armed forces, which is miserable. And he did something that he's done before. He has a bad habit of leaking his private advice to the president, to the press. He did that to Trump, and he's done it now to Biden. And what he leaked was true, although that doesn't say much for him because he hasn't been very truthful to this point. But I think he's afraid. I think he's afraid that we might consider intervening somehow or another in Ukraine as Ukraine is finally and completely defeated. So I think he said the following. He said, look, the Ukrainians have done about all they can reasonably do. We shouldn't expect them to do more than they have. And secondly, this is a good time to negotiate. Actually speaking, it's not. There are no more good times to negotiate because the Russians hold all of the cards and the Ukrainians hold nothing. The best the Ukrainians can hope for at this point is a ceasefire, and then they'll have to agree to cede large quantities of territory and end this war, because if they don't, they're going to be utterly and completely destroyed. And I think Milley knows that. So he leaked that to the New York Times because it was made clear to him by the president's advisors, the Secretary of State. Virtually everyone on the civilian side of the equation said, absolutely not, we will not negotiate. And I think the reason for that is very obvious. They do not want to admit that they were wrong, that they should have stopped this war months ago before it got started. They don't want to admit that they have been lying to the American people repeatedly about the true state of affairs on the ground in Ukraine. But Milley is afraid that he might be asked to do something, that the forces we have on the ground in Poland might be asked to do something. He doesn't want to do it, and for good reason. We're in no position to go to war with Russia. And anything that we might do on the ground would fail miserably, and we'd be embarrassed. But obviously, no one is listening. And when I say no one, I mean no one in Washington. You have some Republicans, some conservatives who've raised issues about the money, but even there's no real understanding of just how desperate the situation is in Western Ukraine. So what we can look forward to, in addition to this massive offensive, is the migration of several million more Ukrainians to the West because they have nowhere else to go. And the military headquarters and most of the remaining power that exists is all being channeled to the far western part of Ukraine towards Lvov, which sits just about 20 miles from the Polish border. So Ukrainians know what's coming. There's not much they can do about it at this point. But instead of throwing them a lifeline, we've essentially told them to sink with the ship that they're on.
Wow. Yeah, that's not very, we're told that all this we're doing is for the people of Ukraine, and yet it doesn't seem like that's the least of our concerns from Washington's perspective. Looking at foreignpolicy.com, the magazine says, Congress says to Ukraine, we've still got your back. And it's got quotes in here from Senator Jim Risch, the top Republican on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, saying this is probably one of the most bipartisan issues that I've ever seen since I've been in Congress, to continually give more weapons in support to Ukraine. You've got some quotes in here talking about, we're still worried after this post-Trump hangover, even 2 years later, with wondering what comes after 2024 and whether a new MAGA coalition could override bipartisan Ukraine support. So they're really worried that anybody in Congress would reflect the will of the people to not want to continually support this no-win situation. But yet, President Biden says he wants to get $37 billion more for Ukraine. I guess FTX and that whole thing was very nice for that party. You want to take care of them, right?
Well, I think Senator Risch that you're talking about is one of the leading rhinos who's profited enormously from defense spending. And I'm sure that his donors, who are the same donors for Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer and a whole, passel of people on the Hill, are encouraging him to continue to throw money at defense. Because remember, we ship over equipment, but most of the dollars don't go to Ukraine. They are just simply laundered through the process and end up in the pockets of donors. And the donors, when they're happy, end up subsidizing the members of the Senate and the House who support the bad policies they advocate. So this is a sort of self-licking ice cream cone. At the same time, we have no idea what happens to much of the equipment. Some of it is used, some of it is resold. We are, of course, subsidizing what remains of the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian government. They're effectively now a dependent of the United States and American largesse. But I think the great tragedy here is exactly what you just described. All of these people will benefit. Ukraine will be destroyed. Ultimately, what will emerge from all of this is probably a rump Ukraine with everything south to the Black Sea and to the east of the upper river under permanent Russian control. And that rump Ukraine will be left to die on the vine as some sort of neutral territory, and no one will mention it again once it happens. I mean, what do we do whenever we go somewhere and we fail miserably and we leave? We stop talking about it, David. We stopped talking about Vietnam after we left. We've stopped talking about Iraq and Afghanistan. We've never really talked about Libya. So wherever we go and we fail, we just stop talking and people move on to the next cash cow.
Yeah, you don't hear, people don't talk about Syria. I remember when Morning Joe would breathlessly report how important it was to intervene in Syria. I remember that every day. The only
That's
time
right.
Trump ever got good positive coverage from the media was when he would, do something in Syria. So they really wanted that. And when that didn't happen the way they wanted, you don't hear about that country. It's as if it doesn't exist.
Well, the armchair generals and warmongers lose interest once there's no more money in it, and they all want to cover up the failure. The danger, of course, with Ukraine is very different. I mean, right now, we could use all of those troops on the southern border. We could be saving hundreds of thousands of lives across the country by stopping the movement of the fentanyl and other illicit drugs, by stopping the human trafficking. We're seeing millions of young men migrate into the United States from Latin America and other places. We know nothing about them. We don't know where they're going to end up. But these are hardly refugees in the sense that we normally think of it. So the attempt in Washington seems to be, on the one hand, to destroy everything in the United States and to try and save this, Ukrainian construct, which, frankly, is about to go out of existence. I'm beginning to think that Biden and his friends have the sort of reverse Midas touch. Everything they touch turns to garbage.
Wow. Yeah, it seems like there's no reason why we don't see more bipartisan support to wind this thing up. Instead, it kind of goes double down the other. But we'll see how it shakes out with the new House, at least. Perhaps there'll be a few key votes who could help stop and put pressure on this insane continual proxy campaign. Antiwar.com has a story by Dave DeCamp about U.S. and Russia to hold new START talks in Egypt starting in November 29th, just a few days from now. They're going to hold talks on the last nuclear arms control treaty that remains between the powers, the new START, in Cairo. And is there anything, it says the new START treaty puts limits on the deployment of warheads, missiles, and bombers, and includes an inspection regime. But according to the State Department, the inspections were paused in March 2020 due to COVID-19 and haven't been resumed since. Is this something that we should expect to be, supported, or is there going to be? I know that under the Bush era there was a desire to roll out new nuclear development, right?
Well, I think this administration has very little room to maneuver. It either supports this or it doesn't. If it doesn't, then we'll witness a nuclear arms race that nobody really wants, and all of us can't afford it. So my hope is that something positive will come out of these talks. But in the meantime, I don't know how much worse it can get economically. You have many countries overseas that are dumping U.S. treasuries. Our position here at home continues to weaken. And having brought in millions more of illegals, one wonders how, in the event that we continue into this deep recession or worse, how we can afford to maintain all of these people inside our borders who are not citizens. It's a bad situation, but no one seems to be concerned about it until it gets to the point where everything implodes. So I think we're coming to that point. I hope it's not as bad as Sri Lanka, but I think we're on a very dangerous road. And this administration has no good answers except, as you point out, to double down on existing policies, all of which are failures.
Yeah, I'm looking at Zero Hedge. They talked about this story that foreign central banks continue to dump U.S. treasuries at a record pace. It says that the Fed, foreign banks, private entities, they said have morphed from the largest buyers of Treasury notes and bonds over the past 2 decades into the largest net sellers. So how come this isn't trickling down to Congress? How come they're not saying, man, I don't really want to preside over the total dollar collapse here? Maybe we should wind up.
Yeah, well, the debasement of our currency has been ongoing for some time. And, I think certainly Senator Rand Paul has talked about it. And I think you have a leader in the form of Chip Roy in the House. But for everyone who is remotely like Chip Roy, there are 20 others who are perfectly happy to line their pockets and march with the herd as long as it pays them well to do so. So I don't have a whole lot of hope that this new Congress is going to fundamentally change anything. I'm sure you're aware that this FTX corruption crisis actually crosses party lines, and we now have evidence that rhinos have worked hard to defeat MAGA Republicans, and we know that MAGA Republicans represent certainly at least 75 million American voters.
Yeah, yet there have been basically hardly any representation from the values expressed by that voting bloc, which is quite disturbing when we're supposed to be the world's arbiter of democracy. The fact that the American people don't want to have a continual escalation overseas, and yet that's so poorly reflected in their supposed representatives is quite telling, in my opinion. When you see the stuff coming out about FTX and the idea of people shoving money through this kind of money laundering scheme nonsense, people are, Revolver News had a story about Tether, this other crypto entity that kind of pops up out of nowhere. It's attached to the dollar. There's billions and billions of dollars to it. It comes out of nowhere from a guy who skirted charges for some kind of child molestation kind of network that was in Hollywood called DEN. I mean, it's pretty disturbing, and it's got all this money and it's floating around, and you see these things popping up and you say, my goodness, we really are becoming a kind of third world kind of situation here at the financial level.
Well, I think Lou Dobbs used to say America has the best government money can buy. It's harsh, but I'm afraid it's not far from the truth anymore. And I think we really are increasingly an extension of the sort of banana republic regimes that we find in places around the world. Americans are going to wake up. Americans have begun to wake up. What they need now is leadership, and they need an organizational structure that supports that leadership and changes things. Unfortunately, that's not the Republican Party at this point. So we'll have to see what develops over the next year or two.
Are you hearing from people who would normally not be in agreement with you privately saying, I think you're right, Colonel Macgregor, maybe we need to rethink this whole never-ending proxy campaign with Ukraine?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Again, especially in Europe, I think the French and the Germans are coming around to understanding what a terrible fraud this whole thing has been. And we can't continue. We can't afford it. We are all in an equally fragile financial situation. And in the meantime, our economies have been deindustrialized. Germany, which is a scientific industrial giant, is being deindustrialized by its own government. The Germans are coming to terms with this, and I think that's going to change radically. We need to get involved. We need to go back to where we were several years ago when President Trump said, we've got to repatriate industry, we've got to reinvigorate our energy industry, we've got to reinvigorate agriculture. Those are the things that this administration appears to want to destroy. We've got to get back to rebuilding them and making them successful. And then, of course, our military establishment is in ruins. That was true when the president was in office, but it took him several years to discover that the senior military leaders were not telling him the truth. Well, now those senior military leaders are telling the truth behind the scenes, and that truth is unwelcome. We're not ready to do anything in any kind of war with Russia or China, for that matter.
Well, you mentioned China. A lot of folks in the new Republican-controlled House are saying it's time to get tough on China. Let's go after China. I think it's a complicated matter there when you think about if CCP is influencing our government or influencing officials in different ways, that certainly needs to be exposed and investigated. But when it comes to, I don't want to have, it seems like the Democrats are united around scapegoating Russia for all things. I don't want the Republicans to have their own scapegoat in China that would lead to more saber rattling that would be reckless. Do you see that as a concern for you, or you don't see the same?
No, I think your concern is justified, and I keep telling people that raise the issue of fentanyl, for instance, saying, well, the fentanyl comes from China. Well, sure it does, but the Chinese are not infiltrating it into the United States. That's the drug cartels in Mexico and Central America and the Caribbean Basin. If you want to stop the fentanyl from entering the United States, well, then you secure your border. Take the 30,000, 40,000 troops sitting in Poland and put them on the southern border where they belong, and they'll do some good. Stop the illegal drug and human trafficking. Then we need to turn to the problem of criminality inside our own country. It is not this.
I do think that that's something we have to be on guard about on both parties, is that there's always a desire to have a foreign scapegoat, and the Democrats, and they tend to prefer Russia to be it. The neocons seem to like that one. Then you have this other faction that doesn't have nearly as much representation, at least in D.C. mouthpieces, signaling, oh, well, no, let's make the foreign policy scapegoat China. And both of those are really a misdirection for what needs to be happening, which is we need to take a look in the mirror, a good look in the mirror, and see what we have done to this nation in terms of debasing our currency, debasing our integrity, debasing our reputation around the world by being this crooked police that wants to saber rattle and install its own values into every particular nation that it can. We've got to stop that whole enterprise if you want to have a dollar and an economy that has any foundational strength in the long term. You're listening to A Neighbor's Choice. You can call in with your thoughts on what Colonel Douglas Macgregor has just shared. Highly decorated, highly credentialed expert on foreign affairs. Always great to hear his thoughts, to give us the real straight take on what's happening over there. You can call in at 727-587-1040. That's 727-587-1040. Back in just a moment.